Welcome to another outstanding continuing conversations. I'm Michael Dismuke, freelance writer for Star Trek Adventures, lead writer on Captain's Log, and a blogger on Continuing Missions, which is the #1 fan site for aforementioned games. We are continuing our conversation with Nathan Dowdell, who, of course, is game designer for Star Trek Adventures and the updated second edition, which everyone is going nutso gonzo over now. And we're going to continue our interview focusing from Chapter 5 on in second edition. But before we do, why don't we introduce Jim Johnson?
Hey everybody, Jim Johnson. I am the project manager, line editor for Star Trek Adventures, Captain's Log, and the Buffer Time Lower Decks card game. This is episode 146, so we're cruising right toward 150. We're going to just blow right past 150 and head for 200 here before you know it. But super excited to be back. And without more ado, I'll introduce Nathan. Or I'll say Nathan's here, but please, Nathan, please introduce yourself.
I'm Nathan Dowdell, the lead 2D20 system designer and developer for Modiphius Entertainment and the lead designer on Star Trek Adventures, both first and second edition. I'm glad to be back.
Good. Okay, and so what we're doing again is we want people to, a lot of people are familiar with first edition. Some people might be new to this game also. They just picked up second edition. They want a kind of a breakdown of the book from the expert. And so that's what we're doing. We left off, we are at Chapter 5, Your Home Among the Stars, page 177. And so just give us a general overview, Nathan. What's new and stands out about this chapter when it comes to ships?
So, in terms of mechanics, one of the biggest changes to ships is the change in the way that power works. We'd gotten a number of pieces of feedback from people that have played the game extensively, who just found that there were that power was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the extra fiddly elements that were present in the Starship rules beforehand. And overall, the Starship rules worked. They're bulky. There's a lot to them in terms of like page real estate. But they're fairly straightforward in practice. It just once you get through that text. But power had been something that was a little bit too granular and a little bit too fiddly relative to the benefit that you got from keeping track of it. It was more effort than it was worth. And I've started over the last few years to kind of think of design things in terms of a sort of a complexity budget. You can fit X amount of complexity into a game, but you have to choose where that complexity goes to be most effective. Complexity in the right places, it gives you depth. Complexity in the wrong places just frustrates people. So you want to find where it's best suited. And here was an area where that particular bit of complexity wasn't doing its job properly. It wasn't suiting people. It was just getting in the way.
Okay, so I'm a new player. Give me the blurb on how power works now.
So power now works. Mm-hmm. So let's go to the relevant page reference so that we can point people to the right section of the rulebook. So reserve power is described on page 185. Basically, you either have reserve power or you don't. It's a single block of this is all the power that you've got spare that your engineers can put into whatever system that you need at that given moment, and it will regenerate over time. And you've got your reserves, your power cells, your batteries, whatever. But this is a finite resource that you can use. Once it's used, it's gone for the time being.
Okay, let's put it narratively so that they understand how it would sound on the TV show. Because I think that, to me, is what I did in my brain. I was like, oh, this is so cool. This makes so much sense from the TV show. So on the TV show, you have reserve power. Of course, you have power, but this is about reserve power. You have reserve power. What would we hear on the show? What would the steps be?
So this you would normally hear an order to reroute power to such and such a system, reroute power to shields, reroute power to weapons, to structural integrity, or to engines, or whatever thing needs power right at that particular moment, whatever thing is vital in that situation. And the action that characters take in game terms is specifically called reroute power. The whole point is you take all that reserve power and you put it into that system. And then when you next make an action with that system that you've just rerouted power to, the ship doesn't roll its assist dice. It just counts that assist dice as a 1. It's basically the ship's determination.
Okay.
In terms of that mechanical effect.
Okay, so again, I'm going to go back into show so that people hear it. So Jordan LaForge, reroute power to weapons. That then happens, the phasers go make that funny sound, zoop, 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 zoop. And in the same round of action, they say, uh-oh, we need to bolster the shields. Uh-oh. So what do we got to do?
So while you either have reserve power or you don't, once you no longer have it, the engineer can spend actions in order to try and regain power. They pull power from other systems, try and find whatever extra little bits of energy are available. And you can attempt to do that multiple times, but it gets more difficult each time because you've got less and less in reserve each time. One thing that we have kept is that if you try and restore power, try and regain power, it can succeed at cost. But the complication will typically represent the fact that you've had to pull power from some other system and shut something down.
Right. So you could say, you could put a trait on computers are working slower. And so it's going to be +1 difficulty. Right. I just want people to see how easy that is.
You've now pulled power from life support because you really need to keep the shields up. Or you've had to shut down the transporters because you need weapons right now, or you need engines right now. And so there are a few actions that absolutely require reserve power to be spent on them. Things like regenerating shields or going to warp, or if you're a ship with a cloaking device, a cloak. Cloaking, because those are all very power intensive, so they will take up a big chunk of your reserve. They'll take up your reserve power to use them. This is obviously a concern only for player characters. NPC ships, the GM doesn't have to track power. And also shouldn't really be bothered with it, but also can largely hand wave it when it comes to NPC ships going to warp or cloaking, things like that.
Yeah, and so I just like people to know I've switched, made it when I record because we play on Discord. It's almost like off and on. Like you either have it, you don't, and if you don't have it, let's refer to page 384 and take or 185 and take our actions based on that. It's so much simpler than before.
Once you've used a reserve power, if someone asks for it again, well then the ship can handle it, Captain.
Exactly. And then he still makes him handle it.
Though I'm pretty sure Scotty always has a talent related to restoring power.
Right. There is a talent about that too. Okay, good. So I know that was a pretty big deal. And then shields also, we changed the calculations on shields, right?
So this is another area, is that the end result of ship combat, the particular balance of damage output and resistance and shields, and the particular way that shields worked, experience over the years had shown me that wasn't quite fitting the way that I felt it should. It felt like it's difficult to explain. It was just this kind of like a splinter trying to of an idea. It just wasn't sitting right. It didn't feel like it was the balance of it was right. And obviously, there was also the issue with like small craft having these really tiny shield tracks that basically just got blown through in one single shot and might as well have not have been there. And then, of course, the change to the system with the removal of challenge dice. There were a lot of changes and a lot of inputs and factors, and I basically went back to basics with figuring out how to calculate them.
Is there an ice cream truck passing by?
There is an ice cream truck driving through the cul-de-sac outside.
Wonderful.
I basically refigured how to calculate the structure or the resistance and the shields for ships in order to not just to rebalance them, but also to incorporate factors that I think weren't included before. So, for example, a ship's resistance now includes a factor from the ship's structure. The damage done by a ship's weapon systems are now affected by the weapons attribute of a ship. So that 13 in weapons that the Defiant has, that's how it's doing that much damage. Which allowed me to take a little bit of the weight off it, because it had felt like a ship with a higher scale was just overwhelmingly better than a ship with a smaller one, and that was something that I wanted to shift. But at the same time, I wanted the bigger ships to still have their edge, so that's why I put scale into the ship's shields and then de-emphasized it in resistance. So it's a bit of a rebalance. Ships are a little bit less. They can't soak up as much. They can't just ignore as much damage, but the shields will hold up longer. One thing that I'd found with the older shield system, because you suffered a breach if you'd taken 5 or more in one go, it felt like the shields weren't all that sturdy. Whereas this time round, your shields can take a serious pounding. I wanted to increase the shield track to have those kind of moments of shields down to 80% kind of moments.
Right, which is wonderful. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, you want those cinematic moments, but also you've got a big player ship. You want it to have a bit of endurance while the shields are up. But then when the shields are down, that's when you want it to feel in trouble.
With the removal of the challenge dice, too, I know the challenge dice before, what happened is if I had a lot of threat as a GM, or if, I spend it, I could be spending threat to really jack up their shields and mess them up and make sure I get a breach, with the removal of the challenge dice. In this case, if you do score damage, there's a limit to how much additional damage you can do now, right?
Yes, yeah. We just felt that was something that turned up in playtesting. It was too easy just to throw everything into a single attack, and fundamentally, both for storytelling purposes and for game mechanics purposes, shields, hit points, those kinds of mechanics they're not about representing health or resilience. They're about pacing. They're about keeping the action going long enough for the action to be interesting, rather than just, oh no, it's done.
Correct. Yeah. I've been feeling like in a battle now, you get about 3 or 4 rounds before someone's going to be slowed down with some sort of impairment that's going to have them to make the choice fight or flight,
Yes. Yeah. And we would always encourage GMs to allow the option for fights to end peacefully, for one side to flee, or one side or the other to flee or surrender, rather than going for the absolute destruction of the other. Because as destructive as these weapons are, starships are tough. Starships are built to withstand a hell of a lot. So if you're going for the kill, it's going to take a while, one way or unless you've got an overwhelming advantage. So more often than not, fights should probably end with surrender or retreat more than destruction, and that does go for personal combat as well. Though we can probably get into that when we get to that chapter later.
Anything else you want to add, Jim, about the ship section here?
No, I think Nathan was pretty comprehensive. I guess the only thing to mention, I think we've talked about this before on other shows, is that when you have a 60-year-old franchise and you have so many ship options from primary canon and secondary canon, it's so hard to decide which ones to put in the core book and which ones to save for other supplements, right? And after 7 years, we did so many different supplements with ships in them, and then we did Utopia Planitia that had 80 or 90 space frames in it. It was like coming into the core book, it was like, gosh, how many do we have room for? And I know that my list was like 3 times the size of what we actually ended up with, and we just didn't have the page count, right, to put everything in there, right. And I think I realized that we couldn't cram in Utopia Planitia into the core book in addition to everything else, right. So I just really had to narrow it down. And I know, because like every single space frame that's out there, there's like hundreds of space frames, right? And every one of them has their cadre of fans that absolutely love that space frame, right? Whether it's like a FASA ship or it's a Franz Joseph vessel or something else. And it was like, okay, well, we got to do the best we can. So I think we mostly just decided to focus on the ships that were Enterprises, plus a couple of other really key frames. And fortunately, we have the toolkit that I could add a few more into there as well. But I think that was probably one of my biggest challenges in the Starships chapter, was just knowing I had to cut pages and knowing that some of the space frames would have to come out, and just trying to find that good balance of like knowing this is a core book, it needs to represent as much of the franchise as possible. What do we do? So hopefully fans are happy, but we'll make it work.
Yeah, we spoke about it a couple of weeks ago when we had Aaron Paulier on the show too, talking about converting from 1E to 2E. We converted ours pretty easy. The only thing where my group was like, do we want to go there, was we have advanced shields in our previous Intrepid class, and when we did advanced shield conversion with the new system for generating shields now, we ended up with 20 points of shields. So we're like, do we have a narrative explanation for this? So there might be minor things like that.
Those advanced shields were very much modeled off of, if memory serves, off of what you see Voyager accomplishing.
For such a small ship. Tech, yeah.
I mean, just in general, for such a small ship, it was surprisingly resilient in terms of keeping the shields up. So the idea that it's a tiny ship, but you put in these advanced shield generators, and it will hold on a lot longer than you expected to.
Yeah. Well, they decided to keep it for the fact we're in another galaxy and we're by ourselves generally. So they're like, we really need good defenses. So.
But to come back to Jim's point, I've just looked up some of my old notes, and I've got the wish list that I put together for Starship classes, and it's just the Starfleet ones before even considering the other polities, and it's a list of 24 classes. I was skeptical at the time as to what we could actually fit into the book, but that I figure covered basically our hero ships. Across and other ones that felt significant across the history of the franchise, including every class that has ever had a ship with the name Enterprise.
Smart, very good.
Last thing I want to know about Starships before we move on to the other chapters is I really like the addition of the service record. It's an optional thing you can add to spaceships to start space frames to give them a little bit more uniqueness, a little more variety. I'm sad that we only had one page to fit 5 or 6 options in, but I mean clearly fans, it's a place where you can start creating your own content, fan content, and build on the concept. But I'm really glad. I know, Nathan, it was important to you to want to be able to differentiate starships from each other within a class, and I think this is a great way to do it. So hats off to you for making a really cool mechanic to do it, but not like another big involved mechanical component, right? It was just like pick add a trait and add a little special rule. So really cool stuff.
So that was an element where I'd kind of, first edition, I'd wanted to and never could do a kind of ship life path. Instead, what we ended up with was just kind of that 2-piece. You pick your space frame, you pick your mission profile, you add your refits, and then you're done. And service record was introduced kind of as a nod towards that idea, giving it a little bit more of a life path sort of feel. Though I do remember, Jim, we had a significant back and forth over how much impact service record would have onto ship stats, and because there were certain elements that I'd kind of rearranged in ship creation that we kind of scaled back to keep the compatibility with older books.
Got it. Cool.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't remember. Unfortunately, it was like last summer, deep in the throes of developing second edition, along with the other two first edition books we had at the time. So yeah, but I do remember having a lot of conversations around it. Hopefully, the end result is good.
Wonderful. All right, let's move on to a galactic toolkit, talking about tools and technology and weapons. Page 238. Now, get me correct me if I'm wrong about this, Nathan. But to me, I felt like you really brought equipment closer to traits in 2E.
So a funny thing about that is that the addition of traits into Star Trek Adventures as a system happened early in development, before any of the public playtesting. This was all still kind of early blue sky sort of testing. Traits were introduced because it was a convenient way of handling the variety and capability of equipment in Star Trek. And then, having established that idea, it just felt right to expand them out and use them across the board. Trek was the first place where traits were used in a 2D20 system game, but because they were so new at the time, we hadn't really gotten a handle on how versatile and how flexible they could be, and how to present and use them properly, so they don't tend to get as much focus in first edition as in this edition. We learned how to use them better in other 2D20 games, and then came back with that knowledge here and refined them. So the idea of this is a piece of equipment, it is a trait, that was always the case with Star Trek. It's just we've had the opportunity to go back and go, no, we're gonna double down on this. We're gonna make sure that it's absolutely clear that that's how this works, and lean into those ideas, because these ideas worked. We just weren't communicating them as well.
Yeah, I love it. It made a difference in our game where it's like, oh, yeah, you may have to pay an opportunity cost or an escalation, but after that, we're treating it as a trait, and either makes your action easier or harder or impossible or possible. And it just, again, drove us quickly through narrative with that. In fact, Jim, we played it. People have been watching us play USS Challenger, and that's how we've been using the traits in there, or the equipment, we should say, in there. Whether it's a tricorder or whether it's modification, but it just made things so much easier. I think the way it was explained in 2E.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's one of those things. It's like it just made perfect sense when I was trying to figure out how to, because equipment in Star Trek has always been this weird concept, because it's not like a lot of traditional RPGs where you have money, you spend them on things. You've got matter replicators and 3D printers and various devices to synthesize whatever tools you need. You've got a post-scarcity society backing you up. You've got whatever tools and items you could possibly hope for. So how do you gamify that?
Yeah,
you've got a setting where people can come up with random technobabble devices, or even just throwaway notions of tools and objects that never get seen again for 20 years worth of episodes. How do you write an equipment chapter around equipment that's left largely vague and is always more focused on what the characters do with it than what the tools do themselves? Star Trek, for all its technological focus, is very much not about the technology. The technology is just there to enable things, and that idea sort of percolated. And fundamentally, that's where traits come. And after borrowing a bit of concept from aspects in the fate system, that's fundamentally where traits come from. This idea that, okay, you are in a pit. If you have a ladder, you can climb out of that pit. Without the ladder, you can't. There you have the narrative conversions. Maybe the wall of the pit has sufficient handholds that you can climb up it, but a ladder still makes it easier. Correct. And it's that fundamental idea that that's all these things need to do. Well, there's room narratively and mechanically to play around with traits a little bit more than that, and go, well, this trait might improve the damage that you could deal in this situation, or might play with the mechanics in another way. But that core possible, impossible, easier, harder. Those 4 options, that covers like 99% of what you want equipment to do.
Yeah, and we'll bleed into that in the next chapter. For weapons and technology too. I want to go before we move into the operations chapter about traits. For weapons and technology, you also changed the severity level of the weapon. So it went from, again, challenge dice driven to now severity. I as a funny side note is when we were playtesting this before it was released and we're still playtesting it, I went ahead and created a severity 9 weapon, not really knowing what that would do. We ended up playing around with it. It was definitely now deemed a super weapon that they needed to make sure never gets off the planet. But I just think that's funny. Before I fully understood what severity was, I would have basically disintegrated all of my characters with one hit.
And what did it do during playtesting?
Well, I created it was a multi-phasic weapon, and so sure enough, the first time it was used, and then Al Spader was like, "That's super powerful, Michael." I think if I'm understanding this correctly. So sure enough, they saw an entire swath of enemy soldiers get evaporated in one hit, and then they were like, "We cannot get hit by this thing." So it was very smart how they planned going forward, but it was a super weapon, that's for sure.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that the numbers changed, even if it's only relatively small, is because stress and how damage to characters works changed. It was just to keep things in line with that. The old numbers nearly worked; they just needed a little bit of tweaking. But it's more or less about, if characters have got 8, 9, 10 stress available to them, how many times should they reasonably be able to dodge a phaser blast before they're worn out and vulnerable?
Exactly.
That's really the logic behind it.
Yeah, people need to understand it's a narrative. It's narrative. It's not actual hit points like people think. That's the biggest thing I have to drive home to people. No, it's saying that this happened. It either happened in your favor and it didn't, and you have to explain your way out of it or take the hit, and I think that is so much more creative, because otherwise it gets boring. We all know playing other RPGs, you're just hitting each other till the first person falls down. That is not what this is. This is pure narration.
Yep.
All right, now let's go and talk about operations, right? Chapter 7 about basic operations. What were some of the changes? You talked about traits already. What are some of the other streamlining that you did in here? And by the way, I do love page 251, where you added that little line that I would put on index card for new players, where because I am character trait, this activity is, or because of situation, the activity is, or because I have equipment, this activity is either easier, harder, possible, impossible, or unchanged. This set's so simple. I love that.
That's something that's developed over the years through working on the SRD and other games, and it's kind of become the distilled core of how traits work. I remember seeing this in a review the other day. Is that the actual traits section doesn't explicitly state that it affects the difficulty of tasks mechanically. Part of this was because the actual difficulty, the concept of task difficulty, doesn't come up for another few pages, and it felt like, putting the cut, trying to figure out the order that things go in an RPG rulebook is. It's complicated, as I'm sure Jim will agree, because you've got to try and figure out the order that you want to present different ideas in, and sometimes you might find that you end up in this spiral where you want to introduce an idea here, but in order to introduce that idea, you need to discuss other things, but those things come later, but they have to come later because of other things. Yeah, it's been tricky. So leaving it at these things get easier, these things get harder, and then leaving the outcome of that up to GM ruling was felt to be the easiest approach to go for here, where you establish what the traits are, how they affect the narrative, and then when you get to tasks and you get to difficulty on page 254, and it points out that and it starts pointing out that yes, this is how those factors come into play.
Excellent mechanics on that one too. Yeah. And then what about, I noticed also teamwork and assistance changed in this system. Why did it change? What did it do, and why did you do it?
So teamwork and assistance has always been a little bit tricky in first edition. Even back during the playtest, we never quite found and the solution that we had for it was a bit of a stopgap. In a lot of other games, the teamwork rules that we had worked fine without any extra restrictions on how many people could assist, because a lot of those earlier games, characters were a lot more individualistic and tended to not spend as much time grouping up and working together in the way that they do in Star Trek games. But we found really early on that if you let everybody assist on a single skill test, or a single task rather, it gets out of hand pretty quickly. So we wanted to put a cap on how many people could assist. And in first edition, that was a suggestion from the GM that if you added more assistants, the complication range goes up because you've got the chances of things going wrong. This time round, we tried something a little bit. It's still a soft limit, but it's a harder limit than complication range increase, where you can have one assistant, one person helping, but each person after that comes to help you, you have to spend momentum or threat, because they're either you're losing some of the advantage that you've picked up from your previous successes by everybody stopping to focus all in on this one thing, or you're creating the potential for error and confusion by having so many people involved in this task.
I love it. It's like real life. Too many cooks in the kitchen. I love it.
Exactly. We wanted to try and, having someone help is great. Having 6 people help is a little bit trickier.
That's true. I learned this when I was the lead writer on Captain's Log. Each additional writer we added to it was like, right. And Jim's always dealing with like 10 to 15 writers. So, dude, you're paying like 10 threat each book you write. All right. Okay. I think one of my favorite mechanics too, which I'm so glad you did, because I have to say it annoyed me so much in the old system, and you perfected this time around. And Jim, in fact, you played it a lot in the last campaign we ran. That's opposed tasks. This is probably one of my favorite updates in the system.
So I'd say opposed tasks are something that have gone through a number of changes. I think it was working on Dune that we first started using this version of opposed tasks. Because the previous version, as much as it makes sense when you're kind of looking at it abstractly, both sides roll, and whoever gets the most successes wins and breaks the ties. But the way that it interacted with momentum and a few other things, just kind of, it ends up becoming fiddly to explain and fiddly to put into practice at the table. Especially when you got to try and do things like simultaneous rolls and trying to work out who gets to spend threat and momentum first, who gets to buy bonus dice first, and even if you're supposed to be rolling simultaneously, who actually ends up rolling first, and how does that shake things up, and figuring out how to break ties and things like that, because that went through numerous iterations with different games. It was just fiddly. It was more complex than the end result was worth, as I believe I mentioned previously. So the new version was very much intended to just cut away a lot of that craft, where essentially the new version is the person that is resisting you rolls first, they set the stakes, so their successes become the difficulty of whatever it is, whatever task it is you're performing against them.
Yeah.
They set the stakes, you roll to beat them, and that covers 90% of it.
Yeah. And then we could add traits on again. I love how it says, okay, say they rose their opposed task, but because maybe you're surrounded by their buddies or they're holding a crowbar, they get +2. So you even if they roll difficulty 0, it's still going to be difficulty 2 with those traits. And I love that simplicity.
It's something that that tends to come up in combat a fair bit. But if you've got decent cover in an environment, the cover should really be a trait, which will then improve your successes. Just how much cover. If you're behind a fortified barricade, that might well be potency 2 or 3. And suddenly you've got 3 extra successes on the opposed task for someone shooting you with a disruptor rifle. That's ideal, especially because it means that you can then shoot back and counterattack much more easily, and it makes those fortified positions that much more formidable to overcome. You can't brute force them. You've got to outthink them and figure a way round the defenses rather than powering through.
And what I like about that, because initially when I saw that rule where you pay 2 and then now you get to inflict stress on them, again, I have to remind people, no, you didn't. Your fire back did not hit them. Maybe it hit what they're behind and kind of destroys and blows it up a little bit, which gives them some stress. So people, I just love again the mechanics on this. It keeps a good pace to battle.
It's looking at that phase of all those phaser fights in TNG where you've just got crouched behind a selection of crates and barrels, occasionally popping up to snap off a phaser shot, and it's just that constant back and forth. And we found really early in playtesting that people liked that opposed shooting kind of effect, that firefight type effect. It made things risky and a bit more perilous to stride around a battlefield.
Yeah, totally cool. And then we go. I want to talk about complication range. That hasn't changed. Where the GM can spin to increase the complication range. I want to recommend to everybody this module we're playing right now with my group, which is Hard Rock Catastrophe, which is written by Christopher Bennett, and it was the first time I've ever seen a module, and maybe I'm wrong, Jim, you could correct me, but where one of the scenes automatically walking into it, the complication range goes to 16 to 20 because of these creatures' pheromones. I can't tell you what I learned from that module. It's like you do that and you're making it so that as a GM, you're creating a lot of conflict into the story right then and there. So I really want to encourage people to look into complication range, and for GMs to keep in mind that you could have a game going on, but maybe only one scene has that complication range, not the whole game. And so I really appreciate that explanation here. You don't have to. Complication range doesn't affect people on the ship and the away team at the same time. You can mix that up for narrative. Power.
Yeah, it's just another one of those tools that game masters have to play with the what did you call it when we were developing the player guide and the game master guide? What did you call it? Like different levers that you can push and pull on to change up the gameplay. And Michael, I love that idea. Like have the away team with one set of complication ranges doing whatever they're doing, and then back on the ship they've got other stuff going on. You can get really flexible and play with it and make everything feel unique. Good stuff. So I wanted to touch on really briefly on threat and momentum and the economies. I mean, those haven't really changed that much from first edition into second edition, where you've still got you got your players got the momentum pool, and then your game master's got threat. And only because this is harkening back to the last episode where we talk about that great feedback loop we have, where fans can offer commentary, and all of us are on social media all the time, so we're able to answer questions, offer feedback back and forth. There was a recent conversation on the Facebook group, I think, where a game master was saying, hey, there was a minor change to second edition where certain weapons only have a deadly setting now, right? So they don't have a stun setting, they just have a deadly setting. What if I'm playing a cadre of Klingon minor characters, and I want the Klingon minor characters to attack the party? If I don't have any threat as a game master, they can't attack because they only have a deadly weapon. They can't make lethal attacks, therefore they don't have threat. What do I do? Do I just lean into GM fiat and say, oh, they're just going to do it anyway? Or like, what do I do? So I think I know my answer, but Nathan, since you are the source of all things 2D20, what would your answer to that be?
So there are a few ways that I would handle that. Firstly, try and have other NPCs in the scene generate threat. And that can come a variety of ways. It can come from NPC tasks generating momentum that just gets added to the threat pool because it's NPCs. It can be from certain actions which are deemed like threatening or escalation. Things like my classic go-to example is you're sneaking around an enemy base and one of the sentries spots you and goes and sounds the alarm, and they sound the alarm and it adds 2 or 3 points to threat, and the GM is then encouraged to spend that threat maybe on bringing in reinforcements, or getting the guards a little bit more active and dangerous because the alarm has been raised. Those kinds of, there are potential threatening actions that could be hit. If you're on board a starship, maybe someone takes a shot not at the characters but instead at a plasma conduit on the wall or a coolant pipe or something like that, and suddenly the situation has gotten more dangerous, but it's not an attack, it's just adding to threat. There are ways to get around to build up that. Obviously, any given group of minion NPCs is likely to be accompanied by a leader who may have some personal threat of their own that they can use to give orders and things like that. And an NPC leader giving orders and shouting battle cries and things like that can certainly be a way to just go, here's a difficulty 0 test, roll some dice, add to threat, and now things get dangerous. Those are the kind of the main ones to keep up the peril in the situation. But as I answered to that that post on Facebook, if you've got 0 threat in the in your pool and you're in a fight, is that really a fight or is that just a paintball match? Is it actually is the situation actually dangerous when you've got 0 threat? Should the fight, if you've reached that point, should the fighting continue, or should maybe the enemies are going to be more inclined towards making threats and glaring menacingly? But
that's I want to say people get out. Like I say, I'm big get out of the mechanics and play the game, and then I have to be reminded by people like, well, it's still you. In fact, you're the one who always says, well, it's not a game if it's just storytelling. And so I would get that. Say if it's a Klingon, I'd have one come from around the bend because he knows it's not going to get shot by the Starfleeters, right? Starfleeters, and have him start braggadocio, and all his people are rallying and cursing, "We're going to rip your spines out!" And then each round they're trying to negotiate with that. They're building up threat. I wouldn't even let I'm like, oh, by the way, boom, 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 and then all of a sudden he goes for it. It creates the story. Yeah,
I mean, even if there's no threat, maybe that's the moment where the NPCs, if they're not inclined to negotiate, maybe that's the point where they beam out. Maybe that's the point where they leave. The enemy ship warps away to plot again for another day. There are options that threat can certainly, and I think I've pointed this out in the GM, the old GM's Guide for First Edition, and in the guidance in the game toolkit, using threat as a kind of barometer for the situation as a whole. If there is high threat, the tensions are high, peril is everywhere. If there is low threat, things are calm, things are easy, things aren't likely to go wrong. It's not a bad idea to lean into that and have that guide your role playing and your scene framing as a GM. If you go into a scene where the threat is low, play that the threat is low.
Yeah. Okay. So then let's talk about one more thing in this chapter, because it would have existed in first edition. Nathan and I have had discussions about this probably for 6 to 7 years. What happened to the scientific method?
Personally speaking, and I may well get some flack for this, I never liked that system. It was one of the few mechanics in first edition that I didn't write. Someone else came along and wrote and devised that system, and it has never clicked for me. I'm normally pick up game systems without much difficulty, but that just never. The way it was, it might have been the way it was presented or something like that. It just never clicked for me as something that needed its own whole, something that required that particular way of doing things. I could get similar results by using the existing mechanics as they were, and just applying and framing them differently. So, and certainly we looked at other ways to approach it and things like that. There's a limit to what can be said here because there's obviously, future products and things like that, and other plans all still also fluid and so forth. But there wasn't a great deal in, at least in my opinion, in the scientific method mechanics that you can't really get out of just using challenges and extended tasks and normal skill tests, and things like the obtain information momentum spend and creating traits and things like that, just to kind of build those ideas. You go into a scene, you roll you roll a difficulty 0 task to make a scan with a tricorder to get some information. You ask a few questions, and then at the end, after having asked those questions, you spend a couple of momentum and go, here's what my theory is, and that's my trait, and I've created a traits to back that up. And now we can go and test that theory.
Exactly. Glad to hear that. Because I know we talked about that for years. I was like, I don't get it. And I just turned it into extended tasks.
Yeah, and I think there was a discussion on the subreddit a few weeks ago. I think maybe somewhere else. I don't remember exactly, where someone was asking about what happened to the scientific method, and just my brief conversation was the way we've refined challenges and extended tasks, and even just using strategic use of obtaining momentum, like Nathan was saying, like that does everything that you need scientific method to do. I think scientific method was neat in that it was a framework, right, to get you thinking scientifically about the hypothesis and all that stuff. But I don't know that you need mechanics built around that other than what we've already got in terms of extended tasks and challenges. And in fact, we talked about extended tasks a couple of weeks ago about how you can take that progress track and you can hang all kinds of really cool unlockable effects off of each progress box, right? Like obviously halfway in 3/4 of the way, but nothing stopping the game master to say when they get to when they've marked off 5 progress boxes, have this thing happen, and then have some branching things happen, right? And I think you could easily use the scientific method in there as a narrative tool, not so much a mechanical tool. But yeah, I mean, so we'll see what happens. I mean, we have other things in the works, but I think Nathan's absolutely right in that. I think the mechanical system, the way it exists now, you could fold in the concept of scientific method without having to add extra, fiddly bits to it.
Yeah. All right.
I will say at this point that what I think the scientific method rules were going for in first edition, that's a fun idea in its own right. But I remember seeing, I think it was the fate-based Atomic Robo RPG from a number of years ago that had a kind of brainstorming mechanic where the GM didn't have an idea of what the actual outcome was. They just had they presented a problem, and this was a set of mechanics for the players hashing out what they thought the actual solution was. And I thought it was really interestingly done there. The version that we had in first edition just never sat right with me, and much like a Starship, game design is not a democracy.
Yeah. Good. Fantastic. All right. So now let's talk about the fun part. Come on, fun. So the next chapter 8, love the flow charts. Again, I gotta commend the flow charts, which make it so easy. On Discord, I just go ahead and cut and paste them in for quick reference, which is so nice. I don't have to do, with my players. So they can just go click on the quick reference chapter and boom, there it is. They can remind themselves as a refresher. Talk to us about the highlights of this chapter, that the changes from before when it comes to conflict.
So the big one, obviously, is stress. The damage mechanics from first edition overhauled entirely with a new stress system, whereupon stress is no longer just a hit points track. It is something that you can spend in order to avoid bad things happening to you. But obviously, there is only a finite amount of stress that you can take before you stressed out, fatigued, overwhelmed, and can't avoid anymore. There was an element here that I think it was a sidebar that we didn't have space for in amongst the stress rules for how to for different. There was just a kind of list of different ways to describe characters that had become fatigued based on which attribute that they've shut down. So it's like you've shut down reason, you are confused. You have shut down fitness, you're exhausted. You're different things like that, where it kind of gave a bit of a narrative nudge to the type of stressed out, or the type of fatigue that you had become. But I can see why that went on the cutting room floor, because it was it wasn't necessary, but it was one of those nice to haves. But one of the other reasons for switching to this type of stress, aside from the changes to the way that damage worked, was also to again borrow from Dreams and Machines and follow and have stress recover a bit more slowly, rather than end of scene, get everything back. Because on another rewatch of various shows, there are plenty of situations where characters are forced to rest, forced to stop and slow down because they've been burning the candle at both ends. I recall like season 3 of Enterprise, Phlox having to order Trip to take bed rest because he's completely exhausted. And I figured it was more interesting to have stress come back more slowly, because then it prompts characters to stop and do other things. Get your stress back all at once, your character just carries on going. There's no reason for a character to take a break, stop in 10 forward for a drink, things like that. Now there's a reason to it, and it gives opportunities to stop and role play a little bit more. The other tweak, of course, is that stress is now, it's part of the overall conflict rules, rather than specifically a combat thing. Combat's where it's most used, but it is still relevant in social conflict and in environmental situations as well. There are circumstances where bad thing happens and you can spend stress to avoid it, and those don't have to be combat.
Exactly. I love it. I love the fact that now, after a battle scene where someone has stress in our game, we have to have a cut scene for them to get back in, healed up, talk to the counselor, talk to a friend. It's really cool. All right. Anything else on that chapter? Go ahead.
Obviously, then moving into social conflict, obviously we've leaned a little bit into that as well, and put in situations where someone's trying to persuade you, and that becomes, there is an option there to resist and spend stress, or try and avoid the consequences of that, and tying the social tools a little bit more thoroughly into that, rather, because they were a little bit more abstract beforehand. I think they fit together a little bit more smoothly now, would work a little bit more nicely. I think there's more interesting things that can be done with them for some relatively small changes.
Exactly. Very good.
Do you want to, Nathan, talk a little bit about some of the tweaks that we made to major and minor actions, and just trying to give everybody a little bit more to do, and just like interesting varieties of things?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that comes more under Starship combat rather than a personal combat. Personal combat's largely the same. But ship combat, there was a definite push. As much as it does seem at first to be a bit daunting to have every position on the ship's bridge have its own set of character actions that different players have got to learn, it can be once it's presented well, it's relatively easy to handle. But a concern was to make sure that everybody on the bridge during a ship combat has some interesting choices to make, which in some cases meant stripping down and streamlining some of the options they had before, because there were choices there that weren't interesting, and in some cases it means expanding out the options that are available, in order to so that there aren't so many no-brainer action options. Part of that was giving more people minor actions that they could do during ship combat, because they were a largely underused resource in first edition. Part of it was fleshing out and giving more examples for what characters can do with just creating traits and generating momentum from these different positions. If you create traits from the communication station, that's going to have very different effects than creating a trait from the science station, or from ops, or from main engineering, or from the captain's chair. If you're creating a trait from the captain's chair, that's probably giving orders, calling out a battle plan, giving an inspiring speech. It's not what you do at the helm by comparison.
Yeah.
So, and there were some other tweaks. Helm in particular got I played around with those to move the basic movement actions into minor actions, because a supporting character that's not being controlled by a player can always take whatever minor actions they need in order to follow their superior's orders, which means that if you've got a small group, you don't really want someone having to play a character at the helm all the time. You can have a minor supporting character, like on the Enterprise D. You never all the helmsmen were basically extras, except for Ensign Rowe, Geordie, and Wesley. There were a load of extras that would sit at the helm. So you've got this minor supporting character at the helm. They can still move the ship, fire the thrusters, move the impulse engines. If you want them to do something more, you give them a direct order and let them do a major action. But otherwise, normal movement of the ship can be done by a minor supporting character, without needing to take up any actions from the players, letting the players focus on other things.
Well,
which is great on a big ship.
Are you using that as an assist action then? Or are you saying no, just go ahead and activate the supporting character?
Basically, if a minor supporting character that isn't being directly controlled by a player character will take whatever minor actions are needed in order to basically keep up with the player characters. So in this instance, you basically go, on the captain's turn, the supporting character at the helm moves the ship at impulse, and that's it, because that's all it needs to be.
Right. No role needed for that.
No role needed, because it's a minor action from a character that's not controlled. The idea being that you don't roll unless you're controlled by a player.
But let me clarify, you're not spending a supporting character point to do that, are you?
Arguably, you would still have to, yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. That's how I play. So what I do in that situation, if they don't want to activate the character, I tell them, treat it as a ship assist dice.
That would work too. But fundamentally, you can just say they are there. If you're not in an active combat situation, you don't even need to mention them. You just kind of hand wave it and role play it in the background. But you get into a combat system, you've got a spare crew support. You go, okay, well, the helmsman is there, and now they're moving. And if you want them to take evasive actions, if you want them to ram the enemy ship, if you want them to perform attack pattern, Kirk, Theta, whatever, the captain can give a direct order and let them take a major action when they wouldn't normally be able to, on top of the minor actions they're getting for just moving the ship around.
Very clear. Makes sense. Good. Yeah. And again, very easy flow charts on all of this, which I really love in the chapter. I mean, those flow charts, you could pull them aside and just kind of have them on your table. I know they're going to be included, which we'll talk next week about the Game Master's Toolkit, with the screen, but really well done.
Having these kinds of summary sheet style layouts, during playtesting with first edition, I'd created summary sheets for my own test groups, and those were used as the basis for the ones with the GM screen in first edition. And those, I use those more than I use the GM screen with first edition. I don't like GM screens. I think they get in the way between the player, especially that big one. And I like to be able to reach the middle of the table, because that's where I put the threat. And having a GM screen gets in the way of that. So those summary sheets, if I was setting up a table for a demo, I'd lay those out around the place. And new players coming to the table, especially at the Star Trek convention, coming to a table and having fancy LCAR's little consoles in front of them listing the things that they can do. Loved it. And having that kind of one page, these are the things that you can do at your station on the bridge. Those are great. Players just click with them a lot more than if it was just a list of text in a rule book.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question for you, Nathan. We've had a couple of episodes in the past of talking about medical officers, and I know there's been a couple of conversations on social media here and there about the one role that we didn't really focus on for Starship combat, which I think from a meta level makes sense, but just from your perspective, in your experience as a game master and as the system designer, obviously, if you have a player who's playing the chief medical officer or a doctor or a medical officer, what do you tell them when they say, well, what can I do during Starship combat other than just sit in sickbay waiting for casualties? What's your perspective?
I mean, if ship combat is happening every week, then you've got a very specific style of game in the first place. It's a ship's doctor, chief medical officer, whatever the specifics are, there's no easy concept for what they should be getting up to during ship combat other than being in sickbay waiting for casualties to come in. That's kind of the logical thing. And we don't really have a kind of granular, the ship's been hit, it's taken X number of casualties thing for the doctor to do. And to be honest, that would be that's just kind of perfunctory rolling. It's giving them an action, but they've only really got that one action. It's a really difficult situation to try and balance, because you want every character to have their opportunities to play around, but it's not a circumstance that really is conducive to being a ship's doctor. It's not a situation. So those kind of situations, I'd probably recommend a supporting character in those instances as the very baseline. Is you're not, you're playing the ship's doctor. You're not going to be doing a great deal during ship combat because this isn't a focus. This isn't a time that's going to focus on you. So play another character instead. But the other thing is, ship's doctors have a tendency to have this problem a lot, where they kind of get the short end of the stick because almost the player focuses them on being a really good physician, and then it leaves them not, and then wonder why they don't get to do anything when there isn't a medical emergency every episode.
Our doctor is big into fisticuffs on ours, and he even gave himself the trait troublemaker so that he loses it more often than not in situations, which is or he just goes into combat mode. So that's how they adapted for that. So
I think part of that, as an overall kind of part of that, there's an overall solution that needs to be had of trying to keep the ship's doctor involved in things beyond just what they get up to in sickbay, which is entirely possible if you look at the shows. I mean, you look at Voyager, they had a doctor who was physically confined to sickbay for the first 3 seasons. He still got plenty to do that wasn't being a doctor. That he had more opportunities for character growth, for exploration, for interactions with characters in other situations, even if he physically couldn't leave sickbay. His first away mission was to the holodeck.
So it's all in the writing. It's all in the writing. Is the point.
Lot of it is in the writing. I would point out that the best example of this is TNG. You look at Dr. Crusher, and great character, but almost never has anything real to do. She gets a few episodes, some of them good, some of them infamous, and otherwise just kind of is there. And then you look at season 2 of TNG, and Dr. Pulaski, as much as she is often criticized or disliked, particularly for her interactions with Data, she is not just in every episode of that season, but she is an active participant in a lot of stories. in ways that are way beyond just she's the ship's doctor. She goes out of her way to get involved in much the same way that Bones does. Bones is always on the bridge in the original series. He's always on away teams. There are very few situations that he's not involved in. Just because he's the ship's doctor doesn't mean he can't also go off and do other things.
Correct.
And I think the same would apply in ship combat. Is if push comes to shove in ship combat, you can put the doctor at the science station or sensors and have them act in that way.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure Bashir does on the Defiant a few times.
Yeah, correct.
Because the Defiant basically didn't have a sick bay; it had a couple of beds for triage, and that was it. So yeah, if push comes to shove, you can put them on any station on the bridge anyway. But yeah. I think you have to kind of go at it from both directions. The GM needs to be mindful of having situations that include the ship's doctor or other characters that are feeling left out, but also those players need to be more willing to push themselves into those situations, even if they wouldn't necessarily be in them, and to try and have characters that are broad and varied enough that they can be involved in those situations.
Yeah, it just goes back to player proactivity, right? It's all on the players to decide what your character does and how involved you get into the game. So get creative. Absolutely.
All right, cool. Let's hit in our last chapter, chapter 9. Let's focus on that chapter now. Going in there, I have definitely my favorite sections of it so far about game mastering and managing the rules. This is some really good advice. Some of it new, and one of the things I jumped to right away, because a lot of it is same as before, how to frame action, task difficulty, and stuff like that. But the one that really blew my mind and I really enjoyed reading this time out was threatening circumstances, and really focusing about environmental effects and narrative changes on page 326, where. And then there's a cool chart on 328 about hazard severity and hazard damage. Was it all pulled together from 1 year? Am I kidding? Is this new, a lot of this?
So a lot of this, some of the rule specifics are very much new, obviously tied into the new ways of doing damage. But a good chunk of these were present in first edition and have been present in the SRD for a long time. This isn't really new. I think it's just arranged differently and presented all together. I don't think it's. I think we've had quite this same list, and obviously the specific effects are distinct to Star Trek 2A.
What I like about having it all in one shot is in the middle of a story, I can be like, I need to ratchet up the tension a little bit. I can go to these 2 pages and I can be like, oh, these are some of my cool game mastering options to really bring it. And I'm sitting here with threat, and I may want to change some hazards, introduce some new characters. I love the reveal, by the way. Jim saw me spend it in our last USS Challenger game reveal just to introduce a character who exposed another character during a covert operation. And then I love the fact that the reversal is now just one time per episode. Because before, I'll admit, if I had a lot of threat, I was throwing reversals all day long on my people, and I don't think that that's really appropriate in a Star Trek show. Usually there's one huge big Act 2 reversal, so I like that was clarified.
So one thing that you may find amusing about this, Michael, the notion of the reversal and the way it works is based on a mechanic from Marvel Heroic Roleplay.
Oh, okay. I haven't played it yet.
I'm sure you played Marvel Heroic. The
original Phaser Rip.
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
No, Marvel Heroic, the one for the Cortex one from about a decade ago.
With the
dice balls.
Yeah, Margaret Weiss.
Yeah.
Okay. So the plot. What is this? The plot point change?
No, because in that game you had the Doom pool. The dice that the GM would accumulate.
Yeah.
And if the GM ever reached a point where they had 2 D12s in the Doom pool, they would end the scene.
Oh, I forgot about that. Oh my God, it's been a long time. I forgot about that. Okay, so that's where you pulled that from? That's cool.
That's where I pulled that from. It's why it costs basically the amount of threat that the player characters that the GM's likely to have started the game with. It's basically it's like a hard reset. You've got if you've got a table of 4 players, you've got 8 threat and you're all sat there idle. Hard reset. Let's go to a.
Well, let me tell you why I like this too. And I'm going to give people the narrative flow on how I'm also going to use this. I like the fact that I could use it at the very first scene to throw them into something else, whether it's a different timeline, a different dimension, a really bad circumstance. Like I would, and I would definitely use that in a 2 episode. We do sometimes 2 or 3 episode things.
Yeah.
I would definitely do it in a 2 episode where I'm going to start you off right at the beginning in hell, and boom, this is it. This is your situation. No explanation needed, except this is where you're starting out, and then we can go through and play the game. And they have to weave themselves out of that.
I did that once in a campaign some years ago. The players were following up on an artifact they'd recovered way back in the first episode of the campaign. And were following up on the science station that had taken it. And as they're approaching the science station, there are these subspace distortion waves echoing out of the station from this much more powerful than the artifacts had been giving off when they first secured and stabilized it. And then suddenly I empty a whole load of threat at my pool, pay for the reversal, and then I take the index card that I had that had the mission directives that I'd given them for the mission. They'd been told to go and check up on this science station. I take that card, rip it up, write out a new one, and the only thing on the card is the temporal prime directive.
Oh, that's cool. That's really cool. See, I love these tools. Yeah, this is great.
No, it wasn't temporal prime directive, but it was. I think that was the one and only time I have used the Omega directive.
See, and the Omega directive. Okay, so see, I could see landing it right at the beginning, and all of a sudden, everyone wakes up in 1942 Germany, right? Like have them start thinking they're on the mission, and all of a sudden, boom, you're in 1942.
3 years before the NX-01 arrives there as well.
Right? Yeah. Oh, that was
how many times have they been to World War II?
I'm starting to think that the Federation caused World War II. Cool. All right. So
I'll tie that up in the temporal war somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Anything else on Chapter 9, Jim, that you wanted to highlight or point out?
I mean, nothing specific other than just I always appreciate when Nathan has the ability to expound into the inner workings of threat and momentum and storytelling and how it all relates to the game. Right? I love reading that kind of stuff. That's what got me excited about the Game Master Guide and the player guide to a lesser extent, but especially the Game Master Guide. And then this chapter, just getting into the nitty gritty of all the cool stuff that's in your head, Nathan, and translating that into stuff that people can read and enjoy, and because it just sparks all kinds of ideas in my head about how to approach different things in the game. And I mean, it's really been within the last, I think when the Game Master Guide came out is when I really got more confident as a game master and reading all that advice. To where now when people post questions online on all the different socials, they'll present the problem. They'll say, how do I do this in the game? And it's like, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? You can make that a trait. You can make it. There's so many different ways to attack a situation in the game, and I think that really just it highlights how flexible this game system is that you've created. That is, true to Star Trek, right? There's more than one way to solve a problem, right? There's all kinds of ways. There's all kinds of ways you can play with it, and that just makes me really excited that we were able to put at least some of that into the core book. I know some of it spilled over into the toolkit that we'll talk about at a future date, but I'm just glad we were able to get some of it in here.
And on one thing I would like to point out, especially for GMs that haven't gotten the GM's guide from first edition, extended consequences. Mm-hmm. The mirror universe evil doppelganger of the of the extended tasks with a goatee.
I like extended content. Just so you know, for some reason, I can't wrap my head around intervals. It's my problem. I don't know what it is, but I love using extended consequences instead of the interval. So it's my ticking time bomb.
Yes, they're ideal for that, especially if you've got an extended task and an extended consequence that work in parallel. You pass one, you pass the task, you succeed on the task, you increment one. You fail on the task, you increment the other. And it's like working on trying to defuse a bomb. It's ideal for those kinds of situations because you've got a negative consequence and uncertainty, and those are the situations that these kind of mechanics are ideal for.
Yeah, all good
and
stuff.
Just they've now found pride of place in the core rulebook where they deserve to be. Because they are a really fun mechanic that is just there for the GM to play with and have fun with.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah, and I think just from a developmental standpoint, right? Knowing what we have in development and knowing what we wanted to accomplish with the core book, I knew that I wanted to pack just as much stuff in here into this core book as I could possibly get away with. So, like those of you who've been with Star Trek Adventures for 7 years, like the awards that were in the command source book got folded into here.
Yeah.
Some of the Starfleet discussion got folded into here. All those talents got folded into here, and then some of that great advice that was in the Game Master Guide pulled into here and the toolkit as well, just because it was an opportunity to put as much useful stuff into one place, especially for new players and people new to the game and new to the game system, instead of having to buy 5, 6, 7 different books. Buy the core book, it's all there, you're good to go. So just glad that we had that opportunity to make it happen. All right.
Good beans. All right. So when we come back next time, folks, we're going to hold our gratitude till the end of the next episode because Nathan comes back one more time to talk about the Game Master's Toolkit. Got to get mine. All right. So until next time, thanks again, Nathan. IDIC.
Live long and prosper. Be safe. Be well. We'll talk to you next time.